I'm gonna take a look at Fire Pro Wrestling G for the Sony PlayStation, and this was released in 1999. Now this game is the successor to Fire Pro Wrestling S 6-Man Scramble for the Sega Saturn, which came out in 1996. And if you're familiar with Fire Pro Wrestling S, you'll see that this game pretty much just takes the idea from the Sega Saturn game and expands on it. So the biggest addition in Fire Pro Wrestling G is a much larger roster, new moves, and 3D backgrounds. So it's not a huge update considering there's a 3-year gap between Fire Pro Wrestling G and Fire Pro Wrestling S. But most importantly, PlayStation owners were now able to get a Fire Pro Wrestling game. So the changes aren't major compared to its predecessor, but as a fan of the series, I'm content. So a feature you're gonna find in Fire Pro S that you won't find in Fire Pro G: Fire Pro S allows you to have 6 characters on the screen at once. Fire Pro G can only have up to 4 characters on the screen at once. It's not a major hit to the game, but I still like the dynamic of having more characters on the screen at once. Now one thing they really did fix in this game is the way the camera zooms in and out. So if you're doing a tornado match, which is more than 2 wrestlers in the ring at once, there's a good chance some wrestlers might be on one side of the screen and the other wrestlers are going to be on the other side of the screen. Well, on Fire Pro S, when this happened, the camera would zoom out real quick. And let's say if the characters got a little closer, then the camera would zoom back down real quick. And sometimes the characters would move out, move in, move out, move in. So the camera keeps zooming in and out real fast. And it's really annoying. In fact, it actually got me dizzy. Fortunately, on Fire Pro G, instead of the camera just zooming way out real quick, it only zooms out just as much as it needs to so you can see all the characters. Now that doesn't sound like too big of a deal, but trust me, if you like playing Tornado Match as much as I do, that's a big difference. Now you're not going to notice at first, but on Fire Pro S the backgrounds are 2D while they're 3D on this one. They essentially recreated the exact same backgrounds in 3D. I really didn't notice until I was walking left and right and I noticed the ring was rotating. So this was the first Fire Pro Wrestling to have a 3D ring, excluding Fire Pro Wrestling Iron Slam, but that's an all 3D game. So for those of you not aware, this is actually the second Fire Pro Wrestling we saw on the PlayStation. In 1996 they released Fire Pro Wrestling Iron Slam 96. Now Fire Pro Wrestling Iron Slam is a solid wrestling game and it was cool to see the series go 3D. However, compared to what we saw in Super Fire Pro Wrestling X and Fire Pro Wrestling S, it's a poor substitute. So for those of you just not even familiar with the Fire Pro Wrestling series, let me just put it in a nutshell. Fire Pro Wrestling is a long-running series that started in 1989. The first one was called Fire Pro Wrestling Combination Tag, and it was released for the PC Engine, what is known as the TurboGrafx 16 over here, but the game only stayed in Japan. And compared to all the other wrestling games of 1989, and even years after, it was just way ahead of its time. And by that, I mean it's a fun wrestling game that you can actually call a wrestling game. So for 12 years running, there was no Fire Pro Wrestling game released in America, yet the series had a following in America. I can't help but think emulation had a big part to play in that. And in 2001, they released the first Fire Pro Wrestling game in America. It was called Fire Pro Wrestling Advance, and it came out for the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance also received a sequel of that game. And later this year, Fire Pro Wrestling Returns is going to come out for the PlayStation 2. Now I'm a huge fan of the series, and I think this is a huge step in the series. I guess it's hard to say if that game's going to be a success. I imagine most wrestling fans are just waiting for the next SmackDown vs. Raw, and I gotta tell you, that is one shitty series. I have SmackDown vs. Raw 2007, and man, that is one piece of fucking garbage. I wouldn't even use it as a coaster, it's such a piece of shit. But anyway, moving on. So I haven't made it a secret, Fire Pro Wrestling G is just an awesome game, and it's hands down the best wrestling game on the PlayStation. So if you just want to play this game and you can find it cheap, I'd say jump right on top of it. It works perfectly on all the major PlayStation emulators and it's just fun as hell. So I give this game an A, and it's definitely worth giving a shot if you're a wrestling fan. But unless you're some sort of collector like me, you're probably just better off waiting for Fire Pro Wrestling Returns.